Hey everyone, today I wanted to make a video going over weapons that I think are going to be relevant in endgame PvE in the final shape. A lot of you have been asking me to make day 1 prep videos, and this video exists to serve both new and returning players looking for a shopping list going into the next DLC, as well as veteran players looking to cover their bases in preparation for the day 1. A couple things. This video will consider all currently available weapons in Destiny 2, but it will also discuss some leaked weapons that will release in the final shape. If you want to avoid spoilers, I will be showing screenshots of some leaked weapons that I think will be viable in endgame content. There won't be any story or lore spoilers, but if you do not want to see these weapons, be warned that they are in this video. All of the options presented here exist to fill a specific weapon function. I will also present alternatives for each and every weapon I list, but the weapons I choose are going to be those that strike the best balance between availability and potency. There are some weapons that have been intentionally left off of this list. Wilderflight is probably a good example. This list is explicitly designed around consistency and day 1 type scenarios, as well as taking into account the content that an average endgame player, not speedrunner, would play. For that reason, a lot of weapons have been left off of this list that do not suit consistency focused gameplay. And finally, if you want to see all of these weapons and their roles in spreadsheet form, I created a new shopping list tab in the endgame analysis spreadsheet for all to see, linked in the description as usual. Let's start off with the Kinetic slot. The first weapon that I think you should have in the Kinetic slot is a Kinetic Blinding Jail. Now, Kinetic Blinding Jails, the reason why I haven't included any Energy Blinding Jails in this list is because I tend to, in the many hours of endgame content that I've played, not really use Energy Blinding Jails compared to Kinetic Blind Jails. Maybe you're pairing it with Sunshot or Divinity, but a Kinetic Blinding Jail is generally the slot that you should look at if you're thinking of using a Blinding Jail in endgame content. So the jail that I'm going to recommend here is Pardon Our Dust with Auto, Demo, and Disorienting. Now, of course, you can use an alternative like the Malicious Birthright with Auto Lead, Lingering Dread with Auto Chill Clip, or Ignition Code with something like Slide Shot Frenzy, but this is the easiest one to get at the moment, and Blinding Jails, you don't have to be too picky with their roles. As long as you have something like Auto or Slide Shot with Disorienting, you're pretty much set. That's all the quality of life that you need. Next up, we have the Mountaintop. Now, the Mountaintop I think is a little bit overrated for boss DPS, but when it comes to Major Burst, it's a pretty safe option you can play from range, and it is very good consistency-focused gameplay. It's a little easier to use than trying to hit a crit with like a recombination succession, and of course, it's great for traversal as well. A lot of people aren't super aware of this, but the fact that you can use Mountaintop to give classes like Hunter and Titan a lot of verticality that they wouldn't already have is useful for a lot of traversal sections outside of a day 1 and inside of a day 1 as well. Coming up next, we have a leaked weapon, so avert your eyes if you care about that sort of thing, but I'm going to be talking about Lost Signal. Lost Signal is a stasis area denial frame grenade launcher, and basically what it sounds like is this is going to be a stasis version of Witherhoard. Now, it can't stick enemies directly because I think that would be kind of infringing too much on Witherhoard's copyright, but Lost Signal, it sounds like it'll be pretty good. It has taken on Ignition Code's kind of model here, and if it gets a perk like Autoloading Holster, I see it being a pretty strong grenade launcher option. That being said, there are some alternatives in this slot for an ad clear Kinetic slot GL, stuff like Tusk of the Boar, stuff like New Pacific Epitaph, but I do think Lost Signal will be a strong contender in the final shape. Next up, we have Scatter Signal. Now, typically when we're talking about optimal boss DPS, I tend to advocate away from fusion rifles because they tend to be lower DPS without really providing any sort of benefit. However, on a day 1 or in a consistency focused fire team, this changes, because hitting a crit with a sniper is not always easy, especially if you don't have a div up. Shotguns are not always safe to use. Fusion rifles strike this nice balance between mid-range, ease of use, and fairly decent DPS, so if you're a galley user or a tractor user, Scatter Signal from this season with Overflow Controlled Burst is a must-have in the Kinetic slot. Next up, for champion stunning, we have Riptide. Now, I would be remiss to mention stuff like Deliverance and Burden of Guilt, both of which with the chill clip changes can 2-shot stun and unstop or freeze any target. However, Riptide is great for overload stunning with its fast charge time as it's a rapid fire frame. Great perks, auto chill clip, lead chill clip, field chill clip. It is anything you could really ask for out of a chill clip fusion rifle, so it's still an essential pick for day 1 and overload stun champion content. Next up, we have Warden's Law. Now, I don't think this needs any introduction. This is the highest legendary primary DPS in the game with Lucky Pants. Now, if you don't have this unlocked from the Nightfall playlist, unfortunately, you're probably out of luck. Let's see what I did there. Anyways, you're probably out of luck, which is kind of unfortunate, but yeah, 4 times a charm, Vorpal weapon. I'm going to retest this thing next season with the hand cannon changes, loss of spec mods, etc. We're going to compare it against Malfeasance, but if we're talking about specifically legendary hand cannons, this is definitely the top of the list. Next up, we have Midnight Coup for ad clear hand cannons. Now, Add clear hand cannons, you could also use Fatebringer. I do think Midnight Coup has the better perk spread of the two. It also has an origin trait, which is pretty positive compared to Fatebringer, which has nothing. Now, in terms of the roles I'm going to recommend, I think Firefly and Explosive Payload are good in the first column, and in the second column, One for All and Frenzy. A lot of people have been talking about this Firefly One for All role. They really enjoy it, so I'd be remiss to not recommend that. And of course, just to keep this in mind, I'm recommending hand cannons, pulse rifles, and sidearms as primaries in this upcoming day one or for consistency-focused gameplay. Hand cannons are great against majors elites, pulse rifles are good for ad clear in general, and sidearms are good for close range where pulse rifles feel kind of uncomfortable to use. So moving on, after Midnight Coup, we have Blast Furnace. Now, this Blast Furnace role, admittedly, I haven't really farmed for Blast Furnace that much recently, so I'll probably change my Onslaught focus to Blast Furnace in the near future and try to get a better role. But Blast Furnace, I'm going to go ahead and recommend Kinetic Tremors in the first column and Firefly, Frenzy, or One for All in the second column. This is a great pulse rifle that you can use in the Kinetic slot after the pulse rifle buff. And of course, I would also recommend Smite of Moraine. That thing has Demo Firefly, and Chattering Bone with Rapid Hit and Kinetic Tremors. Next up, we have some special weapons. I'm going to be talking about Wastelander M5 first. Now, this is just a classic kinetic 1-2 punch shotgun. You can replace this with something like Swordbreaker if you want Curse Thrall or Demo or Pugilist or something like that. I guess this also has Pugilist. And then you can also use something like One Small Step if you're willing to head to the moon. One Small Step has lead from gold 1-2 punch, but it's a rapid fire frame shotgun, which tends to be favorable in a lot of 1-2 punch melee content because it has much higher reserves, a higher shot count, more opportunities to get 1-2 punch procs compared to something like a lightweight shotgun, which only has something like, 17 in reserves, not a lot of ammo. Next up, we have a classic, and that is, of course, Heritage with Reconstruction and Recombination. Now, Heritage fills the role of being a major burst shotgun. Essentially, let's say you're using a loadout like Heritage and Sunshot in a day one, you get a bunch of kills on Sunshot, and then a champion rolls up, a big ogre rolls up. What do? You pull out your Heritage, bang, you one-shot it with a Recombination. Now, there's a variety of weapons in the Kinetic slot that can fill this role, but I think Heritage is the easiest one to access. The others that I would potentially look at are Until Its Return, which is a rapid-fire strand shotgun with stuff like Auto Cascade, Auto Surrounded, and then I would also maybe recommend Imperial Decree, which is a kinetic aggressive. It has access to Enhanced Surrounded, it has access to Trench Barrel, very high damage per shot, but obviously it's not a slug, so a bit of some range issues. But again, still worth mentioning, but I think Heritage is the easiest one to access, gives the most bang for your buck. Next up, we have another leaked weapon, although I suppose this isn't really a leak given that it was shown on mainstream YouTube channels, but we're going to look at the Call. Now, shout out to Fallout Plays for the screenshot, but yes, the Call, this is a strand rocket sidearm. Rocket sidearms are incredibly strong no matter what per combination they get, really, but this is the first one in the Kinetic slot, which will obviously have its own level of utility just from being the only rocket sidearm in that slot, so very nice. This thing from the leaked perk pool that I've seen so far, I think I would recommend Lead from Gold and Slice in the first column, and Desperate Measures and Hatchling in the second column. There's not really any alternative to this because it's the only one in the Kinetic slot, so we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about the Supremacy next. Now, the Supremacy, there's a variety of roles you can get on this thing. In the first column, I would recommend Rewind Rounds or Lead from Gold. On a day one, probably Rewind Rounds makes more sense because Special Finisher is pretty easy to come by. And in the second slot, I would recommend Bait and Switch or Kinetic Tremors. Bait and Switch is more for raw boss dump DPS, whether you're on Galley, Tractor, you're on long range, maybe you're doing a final stand. This is great for that. And then Kinetic Tremors is good for proccing Cascade Point or dealing with majors in an ammo efficient manner. So I actually have both roles. I have Rewind Bait, I have Rewind Kinetic, and I have Lead Kinetic for a variety of purposes, but Supremacy really doesn't have a substitute in my opinion. The closest thing that comes to substituting Supremacy, at least for its boss dump DPS function, is 4 times a charm firing line Irukanji, which after the kinetic boss damage changes will be a little bit more viable comparatively to Supremacy. Supremacy still has higher DPS, and in my opinion is much more applicable than 4th firing Irukanji, given that you're probably not going to run out of something like a rapid fire sniper's ammo reserves on a day one. But still, if you don't have access to Special Finisher, Irukanji does deserve a shout out. Moving on to the energy slot, we're going to start with our next weapon, which is courtesy of Fallout Plays, No Hesitation. Now, No Hesitation is a support frame 600 RPM auto rifle, and this thing has the potential to increase its own weapon damage and also heal your teammates, giving them restoration. On top of that, the leaked perks for this thing include Physic and Circle of Life, which are 2 synergizing perks, which increase your healing to an even greater extent. On top of that, it also gets Demo, Incand, and Frenzy, all great perks, and auto rifles are of course getting a buff next season as well, so this will be no doubt a pretty strong auto rifle. On top of that, there's some alternatives, I suppose, if you care about like Heal Clip and Incandescent. The Summoner from this season gets Heal Clip and Incandescent. Abyss Defiant from Crota's End gets Curse Thrall, Heal Clip and Incandescent, but it's a worse archetype, it's a high impact frame. So yeah, these are some auto rifles that are maybe worth looking into if you care about using Heal Clip and taking advantage of the auto rifle buffs next season. Next up on our energy weapon list is of course a classic, the weapon I'm holding in my hand right now, and that's going to be Forbearance. Now Forbearance, if you guys weren't aware, blast radius changes are coming to wave frames. The more blast radius you have, the longer and fatter your wave gets. And so blast radius, this will change to be default 50 next season. So this blast radius masterwork, as well as the adept blast radius on this gun, will be quite helpful. So Forbearance, maybe hunt for an adept from Pantheon if you can. Otherwise, you can get a demo, ambitious, or unrelenting, and then chain reaction roll from either Val if you want Soul Drinker, or if you want Indomitability, you can go to Onslaught for that. So this is the energy add clear GL roll. I would say other options for this are going to be Explosive Personality, Martyr's Retribution, which is also leaked to come out. So let me go ahead and show you guys that as well. This is also leaked to come out next season. Obviously it has demo. It has a nice origin trait as well. Melee damage gives you a free reload on a wave frame. That sounds pretty good. So yeah, this might be a contender next season as well for Empyrean extension. And of course, I would also recommend Harsh Language if you're building into Void, as that wave frame gets Repulsor Brace. Next up, we have fusion rifles. Now, we talked about Riptide and Scatter Signal in the kinetic slot. The only fusion rifle I'm going to mention in the energy slot is going to be Techian Force. Now, Techian Force, I have a Cartesian coordinate here to kind of represent the role of this weapon. So Techian Force, I would recommend Rewind Rounds and Controlled Burst, just because it's the easiest fusion rifle to get right now that fills this role. Now, you could say Cartesian is technically better, or that Royal Executioner is more versatile because it can also add clear, but those are more difficult to get than Techian Force, which is why I'm recommending it. It comes from Last Wish. You can get it fairly easily. And I would also recommend, however, as alternatives, Cartesian Coordinate, like the one you see here, Axial Lacuna, which is a weapon that's coming out next season. I don't know if I have a screenshot for that one. I don't have a screenshot. Axial Lacuna is going to be a precision frame fusion rifle from next season, which is going to get Controlled Burst as well. And then Royal Executioner from the Season of Defiance, I believe. That thing has a Reservoir Burst and Envious Assassin, which is pretty decent for helping out in damage as well. Next up, we have Add Clear Energy Hand Cannons. That's going to be Luna's Howl. Now, Luna's Howl has Heal Clip and Incandescent, two excellent perks going into next season. I'm also going to recommend Zauli's Bane, which has Explosive Payload 1 for all or Explosive Payload Incandescent, which is also pretty helpful. And finally, I'd like to shout out Posterity for those of you that use arc builds. It has both Volt Shot and Frenzy, and technically speaking, 180 RPM hand cannons do have a better damage profile than 140s, so something to look out for as well if you're willing to handle the recoil profile that a 180 gives you in PvE. Next up, I'm going to recommend Adhortative. Adhortative is from this season. It has Heal Clip and Incandescent. It's a pulse rifle. I mean, what more could you ask for? Absolutely excellent this thing is. However, I would also recommend Darkest Before, Oversoul Edict, and LC's Rifle, depending on what kind of build you're going for. Darkest Before does have a better archetype compared to Adhortative, but it's a lot more annoying to get, and Adhortative is only slightly worse, which is why I recommended Adhortative as my first pick over Darkest Before for new/returning players who just want something that's easy to access and has like 99% of the power of an optimal weapon. We also have Oversoul Edict with Demo Volt Shot or Enlightened Volt Shot, and that also has access to Cursed Thrall. It's an excellent archetype as well. It's the rapid fire frame. And then Elsie's Rifle, which has access to stuff like Repulsor Brace if you're building into Void. I'm also going to recommend Dead Weight from Gambit. Now, this one is not super easy to farm, but the alternatives are Ikelos SG, which is almost impossible to get from Operation Seraph Shield, and Beso Ostinato, which can be farmed but from Terminal Overload and only on certain days. So Dead Weight, it's available from Gambit. This thing has a plethora of amazing perks: Grave Robber, Lead from Gold, Auto-Loading Holster, Field Prep in the first column, 1-2 Punch, Surrounded, Frenzy in the second column. If you can get over the fact that this thing's base stats are not that great, this is absolutely an excellent energy rapid fire shotgun for players that are just looking for something that's accessible, doesn't have unfortunate access to enhanced perks, but it's still absolutely excellent in terms of how easy it is to get. Next up, we have Nessa's Ablation. Now, this weapon is absolutely not a weapon I would have recommended in the past. The only reason it's even on this list is because of Cascade Point. Edge Transit has Cascade Point and Bait and Switch, and for DPS rotations where you want to proc Cascade with something like Izzy, Nessa's Ablation is going to be your best option if you're fighting a close range boss. Now, if you're fighting a long range boss and you want to proc Cascade, your other option is going to be Father's Sins. Now, I've chosen Lead from Gold Snapshot Sights, two perks that are like completely unrelated to DPS. However, you're only going to be shooting this weapon one at a time, so you're never going to proc triple tap, which is what most people probably would have looked at on this sniper. And you're only going to be shooting one bullet at a time to proc Cascade Point, so you're never proccing Focus Fury either, which is the other damage perk that you probably would have looked at. So I chose two quality of life perks instead. Now, if you want to use Persuader with something like Precision Instrument or something like that, you can, but this is craftable. It's certainly easier to get, I would say, than Persuader. It's a Throne World weapon, so it's been out for a very long time, so you probably have the pattern. And so Father's Sins is my recommendation if you want to proc Cascade Point on something like Edge Transit. Next up, we have Indebted Kindness. I don't think this really needs any introductions, but for the perks, I would say Lead from Gold, Impulse Amplifier in the first column, Volt Shot and Surrounded on the second column. Try to get a good mix of blast radius and reload on this weapon. High reload on this weapon makes it feel really, really good. But I will say, Indebted Kindness, yeah, it doesn't really need an introduction. Absolutely insane for double special, excellent for ad clear, very ammo efficient, good for dealing with enemies at range, close range, whatever it is. Excellent with Volt Shot, just a great weapon overall. In terms of replacements or substitutes for this weapon, we are getting a Solar Rocket Sidearm next season. This is another leaked weapon. Aberrant Action. So this is also going to be craftable. It's a red border weapon. I don't know what perks this is going to get necessarily. So if it gets stuff like Incandescent Heal Clip, you know, this will be very, very strong. But regardless, it is a rocket sidearm. And so any rocket sidearm is, you know, a good rocket sidearm just by default. So we'll see what perks it gets next season. But this could be a substitute for Indebted Kindness if it's available early on before the day one. Next up, we have Twilight Oath. If you ever need a 140 RPM sniper just to dump with, or to use with maybe something like Galley or Apex if you're surge matching, Twilight Oath is excellent for that. This thing has Envious Assassin and Vorpal. It also has Precision Instrument for mag dumping. Now, if you want something that's more total damage oriented, I would also recommend Ikelos SR with 4 times the Charm Focus Fury. It's one of the highest total damage snipers in the game combined with Irukanji. So with 4th Fury, you could probably use that if you're looking to dump in something like a Final Stand. However, just generally speaking, I would recommend Twilight Oath. Now, Distant Tumulus is technically a little bit better with Clown Firing Line, but that is much more difficult to get. And like I said, I recommend options that are the perfect balance between accessibility, availability, and of course, weapon power. And I think Twilight Oath really represents that idea well. Finally, our last energy slot option for legendaries is going to be Retrace Path. Retrace Path available from Dares of Eternity, very easy to get. I would recommend getting Shoot to Loot Demo, maybe Shoot to Loot Frenzy, or also Shoot to Loot Incandescent on this weapon. Just having a Shoot to Loot trace on the day one is incredibly useful. If you need to shoot to loot ammo or orbs or something like that and you don't want to waste a lot of ammo, Retrace Path is excellent for that. Alternative, of course, is Path of Least Resistance if you want to use it with Volt Shot instead, but generally speaking, I tend to take this trace rifle over Path of Least Resistance, and it's also a lot easier to get than farming Operation Seraph Shield. Finally, we have the heavy slot. Now, the heavy slot, there's actually not that many legendary weapons or legendary weapon roles that you need to fill. First up, we have a Damage GL. Now, this you're going to want Envious, Cascade, and Bait. You could replace this with Cataphract with Envious Bait, but of course Cataphract doesn't have access to Cascade Point or double perks, so Edge Transit is going to be pretty favorable. Of course, next season with that Void Artifact increase, you're going to probably want to favor Edge Transit as well. So yeah, this thing is absolutely excellent, available from Onslaught. I think everyone already knows about this, so I don't really need to talk much about it. One more note, I would try to get Spike Grenades on this thing because next season everyone is going to be using backup mag, so you're going to have a default mag size of 7 even if you take Spike Grenades. So again, I would try to get Spike Grenades on Edge Transit if you can. Next up, we have Ad Clear Machine Guns. Now, I'm actually going to recommend Hammerhead as my primary machine gun of choice here. Commemoration is going to be the secondary, and that's mostly because Hammerhead is easier to get. It also has a bunch of versatile perks. It has Rampage, Onslaught, it has Target Lock, it has Envious Assassin, 4 times a Charm, Rewind Rounds, tons of great perks on this thing. I was lucky enough to get this cool roll that someone in my chat mentioned, Rampage and Onslaught, or Rampage and Killing Tally with Envious Assassin. You can stack up a bunch of Envious Assassin and get like a triple size mag, and then switch perks, and then you have basically double damage perks with a huge size mag. Hammerhead is nice for that. Now, if you're going to go for Commemoration, you can go Recon or Subsistence, you can go Killing Tally, you can go Repulsor Brace, tons of options on Commemoration as well. I think everybody is familiar with the God rolls for Commemoration at this point. Same archetype as Hammerhead, just a pretty annoying option if you haven't already farmed Deepstone Crypt. Next up, we have Semiotician. Now, there's a lot of ad clear encounters on day one. There's a lot of ad clear encounters in Destiny in general, stuff like GMs, where you want a lot of galley boosted Wolfpack rockets. In my opinion, this is still the best way to ad clear chunky targets in the game, whether we're talking about champions, mini bosses, majors, whatever it is, elites. Semiotician and other high impact frame rockets like it, for example, Sleepless has Field Bipod, Raytech has similar perks. All of these rockets are absolutely excellent. This thing can get like 17, 16 rockets with max reserves and field prep. Absolutely excellent. Would strongly recommend this anytime you don't need to do DPS with your heavy weapon. Semiotician is excellent in those cases. Next up, I had to include this Apex Predator. Now, in my opinion, I don't think rockets for DPS are going to necessarily be super meta in upcoming content, whether we're talking about the day one, whether we're talking about raids, dungeons, what have you in the future. I think heavy GLs are just generally stronger, but just to cover my bases, I've decided to include rockets here. Of course, you have the classic Recon Bait on Apex Predator. You can also go Recon Bipod for ad clear as well. I would also recommend Cold Comfort. Cold Comfort has Envious Bait and Switch. You have Crux Termination with stuff like Clown Explosive, with stuff like Clown Surrounded, with stuff like slide shot surrounded, lots of interesting perks on Crux as well, and you can get bipod if you care about ad clear with reconstruction as well. And finally, our last legendary weapon is going to be a damaged sword. Now I have Bequest here as a stand-in, but the ideal sword is going to be Falling Guillotine with Frenzy and Surrounded, or Frenzy and Bait and Switch, depending on if you're surrounded or not. If you're not surrounded, I would say Frenzy, Bait and Switch, Falling Guillotine is the best DPS sword in the game if we're talking legendaries, especially after Lament gets nerfed. We're going to go ahead and see how they compare. I'm going to do some damage testing in the days before the day one. But yeah, if you're interested in that, keep up with that. But Falling Guillotine, especially with the Void artifact next season, the increased damage to weakened targets through Void weapons, that's certainly going to be interesting. And I think Falling Guillotine, if we get a sword meta, will be a strong legendary sword. Now, if you are surrounded, Bequest is technically still stronger, but we're going to have to wait on the artifact to see just how strong it actually is. Finally, we have exotics. In the kinetic slot, I'm going to be starting with Necrochasm. Necrochasm is getting a bit of a perk rework next season. It's getting a 1 for Thrall kind of perk. It's also getting the auto rifle buffs. So this thing is going to be very, very strong. If you're a Necrochasm lover, you're going to love it even more next season. I think it's actually going to be viable in endgame content for ad clear. I've always liked this weapon, and I'm excited to see how it's going to grow and improve next season. We also have Witherhoard. Witherhoard's always been strong. I mean, there's a reason I have 100,000 kills on this thing. Obviously, ever since the Blight Pool Duration nerf, it's been a little bit weaker, but I think it's still an essential. You can definitely have one person running this for something like damage, especially if you have Malfeasance users on your team, and like Lucky Pants on a day one. Still an excellent choice. Witherhoard still deserves a shout out for endgame content. Next up, we have Bastion. Bastion's getting a rework to the Saint's Fist perk next season. We're going to test that, of course, before the day one. Let you guys know what my thoughts are on that. But obviously, still a pretty cool weapon regardless. Does great impact damage to structures. Has some of the highest fusion rifle DPS in the game. Just highest special weapon DPS in the game, to be honest. So Bastion is a pretty good pick and worth shouting out as well. Next up, we have Malfeasance. Now, Malfeasance, I don't think I need to tell you why this is good. Obviously, it has intrinsic gut stop, but the main reason why people use this thing is for Lucky Pants DPS. If Warden's Law turns out to be a disappointment next season as a result of the changes, Malfeasance will still be a very strong choice, especially if you have multiple people in a fire team using it together on a taken enemy or on a Witherhoard blighted enemy. It'll be a very strong choice for boss DPS. Next up, we have Lumina. Lumina, admittedly, a bit of a niche choice, bit of a more optimal leaning gun, but I know people that have used this in endgame content, in hard endgame content, contest mode endgame content, and have still come away unscathed because it is a hand cannon, right? And hand cannons are still pretty strong in endgame PvE. Doesn't really have much splash potential, but it's good for giving your teammates a 35% buff if you ever find yourself in an encounter where you don't really need extremely strong ad clear from your primary and you want to buff up your teammates a little bit more than something like a Saint 14 bubble or something like a Well of Radiance. Next up, we have Arbalest. Now, Arbalest has always been the go-to option for breaking barrier champion shields, breaking regular elemental shields, even some dungeon bosses, just their shields completely melt when you use Arbalest, thinking about stuff like Ghost of the Deep. So Arbalest is still something worth having in your back pocket. Now, some people are talking about Ariana's Vow maybe being good. I will do some testing on that. We'll see how strong it is. But for now, I'm going to recommend Arbalest as my default barrier stun option if you don't want to rely on the artifact. Next up, we have Revision Zero. Now, Revision Zero is going to be incredibly strong next season. If you've seen Mossy Max's, shout out Mossy Max, by the way, check out his Twitter. He's posted some primary DPS graphs of all the different primaries and where they will be. And if you look at the Hake 2 burst version of the Revision Zero pulse rifle, this thing hits like a truck. It does double the DPS of a lot of the other primaries in the game. Absolutely insane for ad clear if you're okay with using the 2 burst version. Of course, it also has 4 times the charm and Vorpal built in once you craft it, which is absolutely excellent. This thing nukes majors as well. It's gotten a variety of buffs over the past couple seasons. So I'm excited to see how this will play out next season in the final shape. Outbreak, this has been the talk of the town as well with rewind rounds. I'm going to test this thing for damage over the next couple days, so I'm interested to see how it compares to like a regular damage rotation if we're talking fire team DPS. But yeah, Outbreak, rewind rounds, pulse rifle buff, don't really need to explain this much. You can use it for ad clear, but mostly I would say it's good for backup DPS on something like a day one. Finally, my last kinetic slot pick for exotics is going to be Izanagi's Burden. Now, Izanagi's Burden does have ammo economy issues, but sometimes it's really useful to just be able to nuke a target from long range, whether we're talking like a dived Tormentor or you're breaking the crit of an important boss like Rulk. Izzy is really excellent for options like that. There is nothing in the game that has this much burst damage from this far away in just a special weapon. Moving on, let's talk energy slot next. Now, you'll notice there's only 6 weapons here, not that much to talk about. I would say Merciless is pretty good for final stands. With its impetus perk, it's kind of like Fourth Horseman with less burst damage but more total damage, which is certainly more appropriate for something like a day one. If you want to whip this out and dump your special ammo without wiping the final stand, Merciless is certainly a good consideration. Next up, we're going to talk about Sunshot. I don't need to explain Sunshot. It's Sunshot, okay? I mean, just bring it with you, okay? Next up, we have Graviton Lance. Graviton Lance is already strong this season. Next season, it's going to get buffed by the Pulse Rifle changes. So again, very strong weapon. Not really much to say here. Next up, we have the Fourth Horseman. Now, the Fourth Horseman is extremely ammo inefficient, much like Izanagi's Burden, but on a day one, sometimes you just need to burst down a major as quickly as possible. Sometimes it's a time-sensitive environment. Sometimes maybe you're in a final stand, and Fourth Horseman is more relevant than something like Merciless. So Fourth Horseman, a good option to keep it in your back pocket. Still very good burst damage. Next up, we're going to talk about Div. I mean, it's Div, okay? I mean, probably not everyone on your team needs this, but you gotta have someone with Div, right? So bring Div. If it's a long-range boss, annoying crit, Div Whisper, classic choice. I'm going to be talking about damage strategies in a future video for day one stuff, and Div Whisper is definitely one of the most important ones. So bring a Div, bring a Div. All right, finally, we're going to talk about Risk Runner. There are some encounters where you take a lot of arc damage, whether it's like Taken Scions, like think about Rulk, for example, Taken Scions, Caretaker, Taken Scions, just shooting with arc damage all the time. Risk Runner, absolutely excellent. Top tier exotic primary in those situations. Pretty niche. You know, I almost didn't bother mentioning it, but I thought it was worth the mention. Just in case there's a day one encounter where you're taking a lot of arc damage, Risk Runner is absolutely phenomenal in those encounters. And finally, a special mention to an upcoming weapon, and that's going to be, of course, the Still Hunt exotic sniper rifle. So this thing, from the preliminary numbers and testing that the community has done, is, for lack of a better term, piss broken. I don't know if this will come out before the day one. It seems like it's going to come from an exotic quest of some sort related to the campaign, so maybe it won't come out before the day one. I hope that it doesn't, because I think this will be very broken, very broken. Basically what you can do is, for the cost of just 6 measly crits or just picking up a bunch of orbs, you can just get a Nighthawk, an extra Nighthawk for free. So you can go, you know, shoot this golden gun with Nighthawk, pick up orbs, and then shoot it again, and then you've just done like 3 million damage, right? So this thing is extremely broken, and I'm sure people will build into it even more after it comes out. But even just from the smidge of information that we've obtained about it so far, this thing is absolutely busted. So I hope it doesn't come up before day one, because I think it will cause me headache and heartache. So I hope not. But regardless, if it does come up before day one, get your hands on this thing. I think everyone will, but just a word of caution. Okay, that's all. Okay, moving on to heavy exotic weapons. I mean, a lot of familiar faces here. I don't think anyone's going to be surprised by anything here. We have Dragon's Breath, right? Dragon's Breath is excellent for ad clear if you don't have a galley. It's excellent total damage. If one person on your team wants to run this for DPS, it's an excellent choice. Just make sure not to blow yourself up. We have, of course, Gjallarhorn. Gjallarhorn, I don't think I need to mention, one of the best ad clear options in the game, and of course buffs your teammates' rocks to also be some of the best ad clearing options in the game. Next up, we have, of course, Whisper the Worm. Whisper the Worm, I think, is kind of underrated by some endgame players that are like speedrunner types. Whisper the Worm is really good. It's really good. For day one type scenarios where you just need a consistent damage option where you're not going to run out of ammo after a phase, it can be used to kill majors and elites as well. It's not like exclusive or anything. So absolutely excellent. I would strongly recommend Whisper the Worm. Has great ammo economy, great with a div, and Bungie certainly won't release a boss that Whisper will have DPS problems with. So I'm very happy with Whisper. I would strongly recommend bringing this into the next day one, or just any endgame content in general where you have 6 people on a div. Xenophage. Xenophage has always been a staple on day ones. I wouldn't recommend it for boss DPS, obviously, but it's still pretty strong for killing elites, majors, mini bosses, whatever, from a long distance away in time-sensitive environments. So Xenophage, staple pick, not much else to say. Let's move on. What do we got next? We got Tractor Cannon. Tractor Cannon, if you're able to get up close and personal to a boss and you don't need tether, Tractor Cannon is the best debuff option in the game. 30%, lasts for 10 seconds, extremely ammo efficient, and usually the Tractor user can still put in some good damage as well by using stuff like Scatter Signal on a day one. So Tractor Cannon, strongly recommend. Next up, we have the Lament. Now, Lament is getting nerfed. I will test it to see how much it gets nerfed once the final shape releases. But for now, Lament, still one of the best sword DPS options in the game. It looks like we're going to have a sword kind of oriented artifact next season. So we'll see how this kind of pans out. Heart Shadow might also be worth a mention if the strength of that Void artifact ends up being very strong. We're going to talk about that when that comes out. But for now, Lament. Next up, we have, of course, Parasite. Now, Parasite, if we ever get an encounter like Atrax, very strong choice. Parasite, great burst damage. Extremely good ammo economy these days as well, so I would strongly recommend Parasite for any burst damage scenarios on stuff like day ones or in harder content. It's also great at deleting majors and mini bosses as well, so take that into consideration when you're using it too. Finally, our last heavy weapon is going to be Legend of Acreus. Now, this thing is extremely unlikely to find a use in a day one because, you know, generally speaking, I think if you're close range bosses next season, you're probably going to be using something like Guillotine, but in case you don't want to use Guillotine, Legend of Acreus still has good DPS, good total damage. You know, it's like the melee version of Whisper, I suppose. They kind of fill similar roles. So Legend of Acreus, pretty solid, pretty good pick. Now, in terms of some stuff that I've intentionally left off this list, I think linear fusion rifles, stuff like Sleeper, stuff like Cataclysmic, stuff like Briar's Contempt, Doom Petitioner, even the new adaptive burst linear that's going to be coming out next season, I think linears are just way too far behind in the meta right now. And the argument for linears used to be that they're consistent, easy damage if you have a div. You know what else is consistent, easy damage if you have a div? That's right, Whisper of the Worm. So use Whisper of the Worm. Even if you wanted to use a legendary option, there are other consistent options. Like, I'm pretty sure I would literally rather have people use certain machine guns over half the linears in the game for DPS when it comes to more consistent gameplay. So linears, again, extremely punishing if you miss crit. So even if you do have the div, there's a chance that the div goes down and you miss a crit. Linears are extremely punishing in that regard. And of course, their DPS is absolutely horrible these days. So until linears get a buff, or maybe if that adaptive versus linears just has an insanely good damage profile compared to the linears that we're currently familiar with, linears I would strongly advise against using. That's pretty much it. I think there aren't really much other surprises on this list. If you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know as usual. And again, if you're interested in seeing all of this in spreadsheet form listed out as a sort of shopping list, I've made a shopping list tab in the endgame analysis spreadsheet that you can go ahead and look at. Let me go ahead and pull it out on the video right now. This is what it looks like. It's just a nice little shopping list of everything. There's the alternatives in this column, what the weapon is used for in this column. You have exotics, you have question marks for the unreleased stuff. So yeah, I hope you guys find this useful, and enjoy. I'll see you guys in the next video where we're going to be talking about day 1 damage strategies.